Good evening. Welcome to our Tuesday night Torah study. We've been going through the book of Leviticus, and with any kind of, we'll probably finish it tonight. So that's a good thing. We've been all the way through the book. I've been using this guide here, this slide that kind of shows, I got this from off the web from a group, a website called thebibleproject.com. They have a lot of very, very good stuff on there if you're interested in this kind of stuff, or just interested in the Bible at all. But they have a one-page diagram, if you will, of the layout of the book of Leviticus, and I've been using this primarily because it's true with a lot of the Bible, it's true with the Torah, and it's especially true of Leviticus, that it has, at first glance, it seems like it's rather haphazard, and you have a hard time understanding what's the point and where are things going. So I wanted to kind of use this a lot so that we could get an idea of what's going on with that. I forgot to open in prayer. Let me go do that. Father God, thank you for the evening. Thank you for this group of people that came out to look at your Torah. I'd ask that you'd bless us tonight with our discussion. Help us to appreciate this book. Help us to appreciate your word. And help us to study diligently, to think of these things, and to conduct our lives in a way that's pleasing to you. In Yeshua's name, amen. Anyway, this is the first time I've used this, and I found it very helpful. As a matter of fact, I didn't know before this that the book of Leviticus is laid out in what they call a chiastic form. I've talked about this before. Chiasm comes from the Greek word chi, which is the name of maybe the last, or it's close to the last letter of the Greek alphabet. It's essentially an X. And the whole idea of a chiastic form is it's symmetrical. At the beginning, there's some symmetry. There's a match of some sort, a relationship between what's at the beginning and what's at the end, and then what's at the first level in and what's at the second level from the end. And then it all points to one thing that's right in the middle. And in the case of Leviticus, the one thing that's right in the middle is chapters 16 and 17 about the Day of Atonement. So the book of Leviticus is all centered around the Day of Atonement. Anyway, we've gone away all the way through the book. It's been, I think, pretty challenging, pretty interesting. But we find ourselves up here in the upper right corner of the chart. We've been talking about the ritual feasts and some of the things. Last week, in specific, we talked about the sabbatical year, which is called Shemitah. Every 7 years, you're supposed to let the land lay fallow and not plant it, not reap crops and sell them. You're supposed to take a Shabbat. You're supposed to give the land a rest. As a matter of fact, God calls it the Shabbat for the land. And we talked about that, and we talked about that's mostly in the first part of chapter 25. And then along with that, a kind of a companion, if you will, starting in verse 8 of chapter 25, talks about the year of Jubilee. The year of Jubilee in Hebrew is called Yovel. So what happens is you count Shemitahs, you count you count Sabbath years, and after you've counted Sabbath years, 7 of them, 7 sevens is 49. And then the year after the 7th Sabbath is Jubilee, 50 for all practical purposes. And God puts a whole bunch of interesting things on the Jubilee. At the end of 50 years, if you've sold any of the land, let me start again. When the Israelites went into Egypt, and God helped them, if you will, to dislocate the Canaanite tribes that were there. By the time the book of Joshua is completed, each of the 12 tribes of Israel has an ancestral inheritance, a specific part of the land that belongs to them and their tribe, had things gone well forever. And one of the things that happens in the year of Jubilee is that whatever land has changed hands during the 50 years, it goes back to the family as it was in the beginning. And it's just such an interesting concept. We don't have anything like this today. There's certainly the idea The idea of renting versus owning is similar to this. It's just that God gets to make rules about you can't write a lease for longer than 50 years, if you will. John?
So I had a thought.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of, when we say unalienable rights,
Mm-hmm.
you can't even, the land it was unalienable, at least beyond the 50 years, the right to the property.
Yeah, they could not take it away from you.
Right.
Yep, that's right. That's right.
Unalienable, whatever you like.
Whatever you like. The had the Israelites done a reasonably good job of trying to be obedient to God's commandments, if they'd kept their end of the covenant, to this day then, they would know, I mean, each Israelite would know what tribe he's from and where his homeland was. But history didn't allow that, if you will. They pretty much failed. We'll talk about that sometime if you want. But anyway, that's one of the things that happens is Jubilee. So whatever land was to change hands, what you could typically do is you could sell your land, and when you sold it, you were basically selling it for the number of years left until the next Jubilee. And so the price of the land would decrease as you approach the year of Jubilee. And God even said in His Word, He says, you're really not selling the land, you're really selling a number of years of crops. So if the Jubilee is 3 years ahead, then you're selling, whoever it is you're selling it to, 3 years worth of crops. If it's 30 years ahead, then you're selling 30 years worth of crops. And you price it accordingly. Everything is all above board. It's all, nobody's taking anybody for a ride. You know, it's all, they didn't have inflation back then. We could talk that too if you want to. But anyway, it's a pretty neat thing. This occurred for all land. It's basically agricultural land that was, outside the walled cities. Now, in a walled city, people built houses. And in general, the houses weren't part of the ancestral inheritance, because the ancestral inheritance was determined by the boundaries of the land. So you could buy a house, and if you had a year to redeem it. That is, if you bought a house, if you sold a house, let's say you owned a house, you built a house in the middle of a city, and you owned it, and you decided you wanted to do something else with the money or something, so you sold it. You had up to a year to buy it back. The guy that bought your house legally had to sell it back to you. I don't know about the price, but he had to sell it back to you within the year. If you hadn't, that's called redeeming it. The Bible calls that redeeming it. If you didn't redeem your house within a year, then at the end of that year, the house became the new owner's. And it was his. And it was his that he could leave it to his kids in his will and things like that. So that was an example of the kind of private property that we tend to think about here when you buy a house. I just wanted to talk about some of those things. We kind of were in the middle of the year of Jubilee. And let's see, I'm going to go to chapter 25, verse 32. And we'll just pick up there, and I'll read a little bit, and I'll get you to read a little bit. But like I say, we're probably going to finish. Let's see. So chapter 25, verse 32 says, the Levites always have the right to redeem their houses in the Levitical towns which they possess. So the property of the Levites is redeemable. That is, a house sold in any town they hold, and is to be returned in the Jubilee, because the houses in the towns of the Levites are their property among the Israelites. But the pasture land belonging to their towns must not be sold. It is their permanent possession. So what this is talking about is, I imagine most of you are aware, but if you aren't, the Levites are the only tribe among the Israelites that didn't have a physical part of land. We talked about that. We'll talk about it a whole lot more in the book of Numbers, but we talked about that some in the book of Exodus. For the Levites, for the tribe of Levi, that group, God was their inheritance. All the other 12 tribes ended up getting a piece of land, but the Levites did not. So the Levites didn't have an ancestral homeland as such. Their job was to be the priesthood. Their job was to manage the relationship, if you will, between God and the people. So they had towns. There were towns that they had, and just surrounding the towns a little bit were some pasture land so they could graze their sheep and whatnot. But it wasn't a large hunk of land like the other tribes had. So it says the houses in these Levitical towns would belong to they were redeemable. In other words, they couldn't be sold and then change hands permanently. They always went back to the family that owned them at the end of 50 years. Any thoughts about any of that? That's pretty much supposed to have been of a review. John?
I just wanted to say that determining all these things and evaluating things, you need to have someone to do that. Someone's got to be in charge of doing that.
Okay.
It doesn't just happen. So that's what Levi does. That's what the
Yes.
Levites do.
That's right.
They do the
Assessing.
all the stuff we've been talking about. I think in this 26 and 27, when we get to it, it'll be more of that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But if we have a Torah-gated community,
Mm-hmm.
the elders would be doing a lot of that function, I would assume.
Yep, I agree. You're right. That's the Levites' function in the society. There's several things, if you think about this, that I think are kind of interesting. One of the things that it does is it preserves families, right? Because at the end of 50 years, the family is pretty much forced into a reunion, if you will. They're forced back into something like where they were 50 years ago. Now, in 50 years, heck, a good number of them are going to be dead, right? Plus, there's a number of them that might have just been born or hadn't even been born yet that are now going to be old enough to be responsible people and take ownership of different things. And so, it might be your fourth cousin twice removed over here, but you're basically related to everybody in the tribe. And in the year of Jubilee, it's kind of like starting over again. And what that would do over the course of time, it would serve to give the society a kind of a permanent structure that would outlast individuals, if you will. It would be a kind of a sense of permanence that we don't enjoy now, and I don't know. I don't even think they did a very good job of it. John?
So this is how I distinguish your contract with your Creator and your covenant with the Creator. The contract flows through generations. It passes from one to the other end. If you're tied to the land and that's your inheritance and it's been going back since your grandpa's grandpa, whatever, you have a lot of stake in the land. I don't know. You have The continuity is much easier and more logical to keep that going, I would think.
Yes, and I would think it's important, whereas these days it doesn't tend to be important.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's like, who's your neighbor? If you had to pick the 6 people that are around your houses, how many of them do you know?
Yeah,
I don't know very many of them.
Yeah, but in this case, you'd know everyone and you'd be related to them.
Exactly.
Yeah. I don't know. It's just an interesting thing to think about. Sometimes it's kind of helpful, I think, to sit and ponder these situations and to see how life might work if we were to do the things that God says He intended the Israelites to do. Okay, let me go on. Let's go to chapter 25, verse 35. Does somebody feel like reading tonight? You want to read, Mike? Why don't you read from verse 35 to verse 46, through verse 46.
And when your brother becomes poor and his hand has failed with you, then you shall strengthen him, and he shall live with you like a stranger or a sojourner. Take no interest from him or profit, but you shall fear your Elohim, and your brother shall live with you. Do not lend him your silver on interest, and do not lend him your food for profit. I am Yahweh your Elohim, who brought you out of the land of Mitzrayim to give you the land of Canaan to be your Elohim. And when your brother who dwells by you becomes poor and sells himself to you, do not make him serve as a slave, but as a hired servant, as a settler, he is with you and serves you until the year of Yobel, and then he shall leave you, he and his children with him, and shall return to his own clan, even return to the possession of his fathers. For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Mitzrayim. They are not sold as slaves. Do not rule over him with harshness, but you shall fear your Elohim. And your male and female slaves whom you have from the nations that are around you, from them you buy a male and female slaves. And also from the sons of the strangers sojourning among you, from them you buy, and from their clans who are with you, which they shall bring forth in your land, and they shall be your property. And you shall take them as an inheritance for your children after you, to inherit them as a possession. They are your slaves for all time. But over your brothers, the children of Israel, you do not rule with harshness one over another.
Okay. So starting in verse 35, talks about, my version says, if one of your countrymen. I got kind of carried away on that word. What does countryman mean? The most common translation is really brother, if one of your brothers. So typically what that means is a fellow Israelite. If one of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and is unable to support himself among you, help him as you would an alien or a temporary resident, so that he can continue to live among you.
Is that like kinfolk?
It's like kinfolk, but it says, treat him as you would an alien or temporary resident. So, what are you laughing at? So, kinfolk. So you need to treat the, well, it says basically that the brothers are treated like the aliens and the temporary residents. In other words, it lumps them all together. They all get treated the same way. And I think that's important because one of the things that we talk about as being Ephraimites, and I often think about the fact that then people talk about it, knowing what tribe they're descended from. And one of the things I got to thinking about this, God has always been really, really good. Well, He has a very favorable view of adoption. He accepts people that want to be adopted in very readily. As a matter of fact, in one place, He talks about how those non-Israelites who choose to be a part of us, to join in the covenant, and as Ruth would say, I want your people to be my people and I want your God to be my God. If anybody says that and honors that and decides to be a part of the covenant, God values them and treats them as if they were born from one of the 12 tribes. So I think I just like bringing that up all the time because it's not a question of ethnicity. It's a question of heart. And what this says here, it says if one of your countrymen becomes poor and unable to support himself among you, help him, just as you would an alien or temporary resident. Okay. In other words, just as you would an adopted brother. So sometimes I imagine it's harder to help the real brothers than it is the adopted brothers because sometimes those real brothers can be a real pain in the neck. But then what does it say you should do in order to help them?
Not charge them interest?
Yep, loan them money, don't charge them interest. Give them food. And
victuals, give them some of your victuals.
Yeah. Don't sell them victuals at a high price, at a profit. And then he said, and the reason for this, the reason God does this, he says, I am Yahweh your God who brought you out of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. In other words, I've done this for you, then I expect you to do it for them. Basically what he says. Goes on, because this is a kind of a theme we'll close this chapter with. It says, verse 39, if one of your countrymen becomes poor among you and sells himself to you, do not make him work as a slave. He is to be treated as a hired worker or a temporary resident among you. He is to work for you until the year of Jubilee. And then he and his children are to be released, and he will go back to his own clan and to the property of his forefathers. Because the Israelites are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt, they must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. So all of this is speaking to the attitude that people are supposed to have about their brothers, if you will, the ones that are in covenant with them, in covenant with God with them as they are. Goes on, verse 44, your male and female slaves are to come from nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can will them to your children as inherited property, and you can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. So this is a controversial statement. John.
Well, what verse did you read?
Verse 40,
The last part
44,
about endurance.
44, 45, and 46.
So the conflict is, if you're a bondservant and you decide, I want to become a citizen of Israel, I want to be adopted into the family, not just a guy who works here,
Yeah.
or has to work here, I guess would be more accurate.
Yeah.
Isn't that the conflict? Isn't that the contradiction?
I don't know if it's conflict. That's the difference.
Right.
That's the difference here. Yeah.
So if you want to be, you may decide for you and for the generation that follows you, I've never had it better here.
Yeah.
I'm going to be in bondservant. I treated well,
Yeah.
But you could also decide, I want to become a citizen. I want to be adopted, and I want to fully buy into being a citizen of
Yeah.
the Kingdom of Israel.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's right. There's a lot of controversy about this because it definitely implies that God allowed, if you will, even kind of endorsed slavery. But we also know from all the other stuff we've read previous to this that he expects people to be treated with dignity and respect and not harshly, no matter who they are. Yeah?
Well, and if you don't do the rules according to what God set up for Israel, then those things can happen to you too.
That's exactly right.
Right?
That's exactly
You
right.
can get kicked off the land just like the people who you're replacing
Yeah.
got kicked off the land.
Yep. I guess one of the things I was going to talk about in terms of this slavery thing is, and this occurred to me often when I was in the real working world, I had freedom, right? I could tell my employer where to go, and I could quit, and that was pretty cool. I wasn't a slave, but by the time I looked at all my, my house payments and my car payments and what it took to keep the kids in food and clothing, I was a slave, And so this, to some degree, this was the way the economic system worked back then, because they didn't, like I say, they didn't have employment contracts and unemployment insurance and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Hog on the mic here, but Dennis Prager makes a point to say, in the Bible, there's no distinction between a slave and a hired servant, according to Dennis Prager.
I believe that.
So, when you say slave, when the translators say slave, that implies that there's no contractual obligation on either end. It's just you're forced into doing this, and that's all there is to it.
Well,
So,
go ahead.
well, it's an interesting thing to discuss, I think.
Well, I think it is too. One of the things that he said earlier here, he said, verse 44, your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. Now, who are the nations around them? the Canaanites, right? They're the people that they're supposed to be
Dispersing.
dispersing, annihilating, right? So, and in war, it has always been that, to the victor go the spoils, right? And that included the people, yeah.
Weren't the nations around them were the people who were not actually in Canaan? They were just surrounding nations, right? Yeah.
Well, yeah, there were the
'Cause
Moabites and the Ammonites and the Midianites, yeah.
Because the Canaanites, they were told to completely wipe out. Don't even make them slaves,
Well,
right?
yeah, I have to confess, I'm a little bit blurry about that. There were, let's see, yes, you're right. But what God really objected to was the form of worship that they had. Right. And most of the tribes around them, most of the nations around them, had those same forms of worship. But whenever the ones that had those forms of worship and also lived in the land that God had decided to give to Israel, they needed to be wiped out.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah.
Also, I think in our culture today, we kind of suffer from the perspective of slavery from our own history. Yes. And I don't think it was the same back then. Because a person who was a slave couldn't they, if they converted to the God of Abraham, eventually become a free man, right?
Yeah, I think they probably could. Now, I don't. I'm not
But you know
sure.
what I mean, right? It's like
No. The thing is whenever, let's say you had a slave. Let's say you bought some slave. I'll tell you what, maybe, Eleazar of Damascus is a good example, right? Abraham bought him. He was a slave that had run away from his owner, and rather than make him go back to his owner, Abraham bought him. Okay? Now, he bought him, who knows what for? He probably, I think more than anything, it was probably just out of a sense of compassion. But he bought him, and obviously, Eleazar was pretty thankful. And Eleazar saw in Abraham, like we were talking about earlier, a man of some character, an admirable person. So Eleazar decided, like you said, John, this is great. I got it good here. This guy doesn't beat me up like my previous owner did. He's a good man. He's an honest man. He gives me decent food, place to sleep. I'm willing to put this, live with this forever. So he chose to be a bondservant. Now, when he's a bondservant, he gets treated a little differently, but he also, I think, he chose to be part of the covenant with Abraham. And so then Abraham, treated him more like, actually he did. He treated him more like a son. Because before Ishmael came on the scene, Abraham told God, he says, well, if I die now, Eleazar is going to get all my belongings. So, John.
Well, also when you compare to slavery to, like in America, it's like, well, let's go over there and kidnap some people that are on the other side of the world, drag them back here against their will, and that's biblical because the Bible says it's slavery. Well, that's not the same thing.
No, that's not the same thing.
These guys were given a specific task to go into a land that was their inheritance, given them by God. There's no, unwritten books that says you get to go 3,500 years later and go kidnap some people on the other side of the planet and say that they're your slaves in perpetuity. I don't think that works.
Nope, I agree.
A little different question, Jerry. On the new converts to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, at this point in time, they're in the land.
Yes.
Do they get allocated a piece of that?
Well,
land, because if they become free, does that entitle them to land?
Well, they became part of the family.
Right.
Okay? So if some old patriarch, I say in a lowercase p, had a slave, and the guy decided to take on the covenant and be an Israelite, then he was treated more or less as one of the guy's own sons, right? And so I think it might have been, I don't know whether it was expected or not, I really don't know, but it's certainly not inconceivable to me that he would have given him a part of the land, right? And if this adopted son, this slave, really was a part of the family, then he would marry another Israelite, and they would have kids, and the kids would be part of the family. It all just kind of grow, and yeah, I mean, there may be some talk in the back rooms about how, well, he's really not one of us, but I don't know that it would have. I mean, I think he could have been weathered. I think it would have been treated all right. I'm not sure about that, but I'm thinking so. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't think it's possible to be a free man or a sovereign and not have land. I mean, that just doesn't. You can't be that if you don't have
Well, that's
something.
interesting. I'd never even thought about that.
Oh yeah, it's just how can you? To be a sovereign it really is to contract, to be able to write the contract.
Yeah.
And how can you contract if you've got nothing to do the quid pro quo with?
Yeah.
I mean, your labor is your land, but
Well, the other thing is I'm glad we're talking about this, because this, it makes my mind kind of try to expand and think about these things too. It's not necessarily the case that the grandfather, the father, who's got 12 kids or whatever, says, okay, you get this piece over here, and George, you get that piece there, and Fred, you get this piece over here. He could say that, okay, look, you 3 guys, you're going to run the cows, and you 4 guys over here, you're going to run the sheep and all that kind of stuff. So they divided up more or less the entire enterprise as opposed to individual plots of land. Not to say they couldn't have done that, but I guess my point is it's the family that stays together, and the family owns the whole parcel.
yeah, that actually seems more appealing to me. You just got to figure out who's the guy running the whole thing that has the ultimate decisions, which probably should go by default to the firstborn.
To the eldest, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So he's managing the property, and that's why he gets a double portion, because he's got
Overhead.
he's got overhead costs.
Yeah, he does.
He's got to be like, well, that's what the Levites were supposed to be. We were supposed to be the ones who were supposed to be in charge before the Levites was the firstborns.
Uh-huh.
So that's why they got that extra share, was so they could manage the trust. They've been entrusted with managing the trust for the benefit of everybody else. And I think that's a better idea. You have all your property isn't split apart then.
Yeah.
You can grow vertically, like Joel Salatin says. You
Yeah,
can
yeah.
grow.
Yeah. So I guess the other idea there is, only reason you'd want to have a strictly identifiable personal piece of property is to keep your brothers out. Well, what does that say about your family affairs?
Do you think possibly the difference between our slavery and what we're talking about here is the kidnapping thing? Because even though they took people here, it was they won them in the war,
Mm-hmm. Yes.
whereas we didn't do that with the Africans,
Yep.
because kidnapping is stealing.
Yeah, it was, yeah. I think that's a big difference, for sure. Yeah.
There was one instance of a nation who said, well, we're from far away,
Yeah.
and they kind of deceived them, who basically kind of just said, we're going to be slaves, so
Yeah.
rather than you wiped out.
Yep. Yep. That's true. That's true. That was a nation that was, rather than one of the ones that was destined to be destroyed, they lied and said they were from far away, and so they said, okay, fine, you can be slaves then. They said, fine, great.
Marvin brings up a really good point, and I like the way you presented that those that came in attached to a family,
Yep.
or they came in as part of someone who already had an inheritance, and they became a part of that inheritance.
Yeah.
Looking at it from our modern day Christian perspective, you come into the kingdom and you have all these just loose people that aren't really a part of anything. They are here, and they don't like this, and you have a lot of movement,
Yep.
and there's real no connection. And
That's a good point.
We
Yeah.
somehow, feel like, I think you made a good point that there's value in becoming part of a family and making it work. You inherit the blessings that family has.
I think it's not just a question of value. I think it's what really God has in mind. I think this is something that I struggle with a bit, is that, we're, as Americans, and quite frankly, as Christians, we're taught that it's a personal thing, right? And yeah, sure, we're supposed to be nice to each other and love everybody and all that kind of stuff, but it's, family is different. Family is stronger, and the ties are are there, and even if there's hard stuff, you still have this relationship that won't go away. So I think God, that's what He wants, because when you think about it, that's what He's done with us. That's certainly what He did with Israel. I mean, if anybody deserved to be disowned, it was them. But He didn't.
Well, another thing in regard to this whole subject is what was promised to Abraham has never been fully occupied.
Nope, that's right.
And so not my concern, but what I was thinking about when I asked the question was whatever the plot of land was that was assigned to them at this point in time, at some point it would not support the number of people that it would need to support.
That's a
That was
very
what
good
I was
point.
thinking of.
Yep, that's a very good point.
And so I assume pretty soon, relatively, Israel will expand greatly.
Yeah. How diplomatically stated, yes.
Do you suppose our immigrant problem would be solved if every immigrant that came in had to come in only sponsored by a family?
That would certainly help. And if they came in with an attitude of wanting to be a part of the family and wanting to be a part of the whole, yeah.
It seems like it was a tribal type of a community within each family.
Yeah.
Where these hired servants would come in and they belonged to the family.
Yeah.
I think looking back, I think even the surrounding people, when it was Rebecca that brought her maid, and when she passed away, they made a mourning for her, just like family. So it was pretty near. If somebody served you,
Yeah.
it's like family.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Kind of like Downton Abbey now, where,
Well, there's something
where
to
you
that.
have the
As a matter of fact-
servants that are very loyal, and
Yeah.
you
Well, I
take
was
care of
gonna-
them.
I was going to go kind of with that in that,
Yeah.
one of the things
Yeah.
that we have today is
PBS.
we work for a living, but, it's 8 to 5 and 5 days a week. And, many people go and do their thing, punch the clock, come home. You get to know the people you work with. You might even like them. But you don't live with them 24 hours a day in the same spot. They're not family. Sometimes I think some of these television shows I kind of idolize that. There's that's their family. But back then they really were. I mean, like you say, it might have been a servant, but they ate with them, or they ate the same food as they did, help prepare the food. Like Downton Abbey's not a bad analogy, really. Okay, there's a little bit more in this chapter that I want to talk about that kind of goes on, and then we'll move into something entirely different. Yeah.
So you were talking about verse 45, about the moreover of the children of the strangers that sojourn among you.
Yep.
Of them shall you buy, and of their families that are with you. Is that
Okay, now, which verse are you looking at?
45?
45. Mine says, you may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. Okay.
Oh, okay. Mine doesn't say of the.
It doesn't say
Mine says, moreover, of the children of the strangers that do sojourn among you, of them shall ye buy, and of their families that are with you, will they begat in your land, and they shall be your possession.
Yeah. I think it's kind of the same idea, but I don't know exactly what to think about it. Well, I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that, but maybe what we're going to read in the next paragraph will have a little more to say about that, because this next idea ties into that a lot. All right? So I'm not trying to get out of it, really, but let's come back to it. Let me read the last part of the chapter, starting at verse 47. From verse 47, it says, if an alien or a temporary resident among you becomes rich and one of your countrymen becomes poor and sells himself to the alien living among you or to a member of that alien's clan, he retains the right of redemption after he has sold himself. One of his relatives may redeem him. An uncle or a cousin or any blood relative in his clan may redeem him. Or if he prospers, he may redeem himself. He and his buyer are to count the time from the year he has sold himself up to the year of Jubilee. And the price for his release is to be based on the rate paid to a hired man for that number of years. If the many years remain, then he must pay for his redemption a larger share of the price paid for him. If only a few years remain until the year of Jubilee, he is to compute that and pay for his redemption accordingly. He is to be treated as a man hired from year to year. You must see to it that his owner does not rule over him ruthlessly. Now, this is talking about a Hebrew, an Israelite. An Israelite has become poor and has had to sell himself. By the way, that's how this happens to a lot of these people, a lot of people that they talk about here. They do something stupid, they lose all their money, and they have no way to make a living. And they don't go, they didn't have a culture where they'd say, okay, well, they kind of did. They said, I'll pay you $2 an hour to clean out my barn every day. And then they go off and try to make a living on that. What they did is they sold themselves. I will work for you for, in this case, some number of years, and what I expect in return, or what you would give me in return, is a place to live and food to eat. That's really what it boils down to. And so what they're saying here is, if it was pretty humiliating for an Israelite to have to sell himself to some foreigner that lived in Israel. And so he always retained the right of redemption. And this description, this verse 49, an uncle or a cousin or any blood relative may redeem him, that's the kinsman redeemer. That, as a matter of fact, it was an obligation. If you as an Israelite had some black sheep nephew over here that was always getting in trouble and ended up getting himself so much in trouble that he had to sell himself to some non-Israelite, then the non-Israelite living in Israel had to allow for his redemption, and it was your responsibility as his uncle to go over and buy him. And when you bought him back, you basically paid the debt. You paid whatever the guy owed, essentially, to get him out of debt. And that's a valuable lesson. Obviously, it speaks of Yeshua, who did that for us. So, John.
The thing that caught my eye was, and if a sojourner or stranger wax rich, as it says in the King James.
Wax rich, okay.
So they're wealthy. It isn't illegal to be wealthy and not be a citizen of Israel.
That's right.
So, that if you just stop and think about that for a moment.
Yeah.
So, like Joseph in Egypt was a servant of the Pharaoh, right? I don't think the Pharaoh didn't view him as a free man. He viewed him as someone who had a lot of leeway with things. But at the end of the day, he was the Pharaoh of servant, and this guy was, he was Joseph.
That's a very good point. As a matter of fact, I've often asked myself, once Joseph got his position, why didn't he leave, right? Or why couldn't, Joseph could never leave. That's the point is he was a slave. He was bought and paid for, and he was not redeemable. He was owned by Pharaoh. Yeah.
But my point, in addition to that, is he was wealthy. He was I'm sure he was, if not directly wealthy, he certainly influenced.
Oh, yeah.
He didn't have to have any problem about his welfare in the future. And here it's saying, we can't just tax you because you're a foreigner, who made a lot of money.
Yeah.
Like a lot of politicians think we'll just take it from the rich. That even if you're not even an Israelite, there's what I read this as, they're respecting their private property right.
Yep.
So.
Yep. I don't know that probably didn't answer your question, but I thought it was similar to what you were talking about. Finally, verse 54 says, even if he is not redeemed in any of these ways, he and his children are to be released in the year of Jubilee. For the Israelites belong to me as servants. They are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt, and I am Yahweh your God. So I don't know. I don't have all the answers here to what this means, really, but I know that if we sit there and just discuss it and think about it, we'll come up with what God's thought here is. And I'm sure part of this has to do with, the Israelites were supposed to be an object lesson to the nations around them. God even said it. He says, I want the nations that come to see you to say, boy, this people must have a great and awesome God to be such a just and righteous people. So that's part of it. John.
Well, back to my point earlier about what it says in the Declaration of Independence. Unalienable or unalienable rights are true because I think you could draw a conclusion from this paragraph. Nobody owns you if you're within the jurisdiction of the United States of America, because you are all bondservants of God anyway. So, and He's no respecter of persons. So, to say I own someone is to say I'm replacing Yahweh's claim of being their bond master, if you will. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Like I say, every time we talk about this, I always come away with a little better understanding.
There's a website called unbelievablefacts.com, and they got a couple interesting facts about slavery.
Okay.
It's kind of interesting. It gives you an idea, it kind of gives you a perspective on what's going on with slavery. It says there are more slaves now than at any other time in human history. Approximately 27 million are enslaved around the world. 15 million of them are in India.
I'll be.
Okay, and then a couple more. Arab slave trade began long before the USA was created and lasted 14 centuries, longer than Atlantic or European slave trade. And then over 1 million white slaves were captured from Europe in between the 16th and 18th centuries. They were sold to the Ottomans by the pirates operating in North Africa. So this has been going on for a while all over the place.
Slavery's been going on for a long time, yeah. I think you could conclude that God, He doesn't, it's like divorce. God doesn't like it, but it doesn't mean that that He forbids it. Slavery had a place, but as you know, lots of places in the Bible it talks about how you're responsible to treat your slave, if you will. And it's a much different kind of a thing than what we've seen in a lot of the other cultures. Margaret? Let's see, Margaret's got something.
I think that 55 really puts it all in perspective for any of us that want to claim to be grafted into Israel or part of Israel. We are servants.
Yep.
And we're supposed to serve Yahweh.
Yep.
And as servants, we're supposed to do it wholeheartedly and follow the rules, which are Torah.
Yeah. Here.
But as far as slavery, it's like somebody that I think the negative parts of slavery that are looked at are when someone takes advantage of you, uses and abuses you, is when you consider them a slave.
Yep.
If you're following the rules, if you're following Torah rules, you're going to be treated. You're going to be treated right. Israel didn't do that, and that's the reason.
Yeah.
Poof, they went that way, and they were exiled.
Yep.
Sad to say,
Yep.
I think a lot of this stuff here in Torah sounds great, but when you have men administering it, the greed factor comes in, and kind of messes everything up, and we forget about Torah.
Yep. Here, here.
And it's just, just enriching yourself, or I don't know, just controlling.
Yep.
So,
Well, I often reflect on the Micah 6:8 thing. Micah 6:8 says, what is required of you, man? And he only lists 3 things, but you have to conclude that those are the same. Those 3 things encompass all of the Torah, and they're to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. So that really does capture it all. But if you just said that and nothing more, nobody'd know what you meant. So a lot of these things that seem very disjointed aren't. They are all part of the same thing, but you just have to think about it until you figure that out. Yeah.
If we go back to the Garden of Eden, the original instructions were that Adam was to rule over the birds of the air, the fish, but not over people.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. Well, let's go on. We're at the last little box over here in the upper right corner, chapter 26 and 27. Somebody feel like reading from chapter 26, verses 1 through 13, the first 13 verses of chapter 26. Yeah, it's good, Margaret. You're going to be glad you chose this and not the rest. Margaret said she read it.
I like short readings. Chapter 26. You shall make no idols, nor a graven image, neither rear you up a standing image, neither shall you set up any image of stone in your land to bow down unto it. For I am Yahweh, your Elohim. You shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am Yahweh. If you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments and do them, then I will give you rain in due season, and the land shall yield her increase, and the trees of the field shall yield their fruit. And your threshing shall reach unto the vintage, and the vintage shall reach unto the sowing time, and you shall eat your bread to the full and dwell in your land safely. And I will give peace in the land, and you shall lie down, and none shall make you afraid. And I will rid evil beasts out of the land, neither shall the sword go through your land. And you shall chase your enemies, and they shall fall before you by the sword. And 5 of you shall chase an 100, and 100 of you shall put 10,000 to flight. And your enemies shall fall before you by the sword. For I will have respect unto you, and make you fruitful, and multiply you, and establish my covenant with you. And you shall eat old store, and bring forth the old because of the new. And I will set my tabernacle among you, and my soul shall not abhor you. And I will walk among you, and will be your Elohim, and you shall be my people. I am Yahweh, your Elohim, which brought you forth out of the land of Egypt. And you shall not be their bondmen. And I have broken the bands of your yoke, and made you go upright.
Okay? So this is almost the last section of Leviticus here is this is part of a form of a thing they call a suzerainty treaty. Suzerainty treaty is a treaty between a lesser and a greater. Okay? Obviously, in this case, it would be an agreement between God and the people. And one of the things a suzerainty treaty always has is a list of the blessings you'll get for keeping the treaty and the curses that you'll suffer, or the punishments you'll suffer if you break the treaty. And so this chapter 26 is that part of this contract. And so the first section here, the first 13 verses that she read, are the rewards you get for obedience. And that's what he says. In verse 3, he says, if you follow my decrees and are careful to obey my commands, and he goes on to list some benefits. He says, well, as a matter of fact, you'll find that there's 3 different kinds of benefits here. There's physical or material benefits, and then there's mental or emotional benefits, and then there's spiritual benefits. And they're fun to read, because they It says, for example, in verse 3, going to verse 4, I'll send rain in its season, and the ground will yield its crops, and the trees of the field their fruit. Your threshing will continue until the grape harvest, and the grape harvest will continue until planting. And you'll eat all the food you want and live safely in your land. That's material. I will grant peace in the land, and you will lie down, and no one will make you afraid. I'll remove savage beasts from the land, and the sword will not pass through your country. You'll pursue your enemies, and they'll fall by the sword before you. That's physical also, or all mental, the emotional rewards. Then he says in verse 9, I'll look on you with favor and make you fruitful and increase your numbers. I'll keep my covenant, and you will still be eating last year's harvest, and you won't have to move it out to make room for the new. And I'll put my dwelling place among you and live with you. This is all great, right? This just sounds good. And that's 13 verses or less. Now, from verse 14 through 46, the next 32 verses, are the punishments for disobedience. So one thing to notice right off the bat is that there are a few nice glowing terms, positive things to get you to want to do this. Here are the negative things for not doing it. And they're a lot longer list than the positive things for doing it. You can draw some conclusions from that. One being that people in general are probably more motivated negatively than positively. That is, well, I don't want to go there. That's not that nice. Anyway, let's read. Did anybody comment about the great things that are going to happen for obedience? John.
Interesting that there's another, this is like a second witness, or I guess really the first witness, because I kind of thought it was only in that Deuteronomy where that was. Where it compares if you do these things, good things will happen. If you do these things, the bad things will happen. But
this is very similar to the one in Deuteronomy, but
right.
Obviously they're not.
And it's also kind of like, going over the 10 Commandments again. It's not exactly like that, but he's reiterating again. Here's the instruction manuals. Do these.
Yeah. Yep. This, like I say though, this is a typical part of the contract. This is the. This is what happens, the effect of breaking the contract, the effect of not, what's the term? Performing. Is that the term? Anyway, I kind of think this last section is kind of fun, so I'll read that if that's okay. Starting in verse 14. But if you will not listen to me and carry out all these commands, and if you reject my decrees and abhor my laws and fail to carry out all my commands and so violate my covenant, then I will do this to you. I will bring upon you sudden terror, wasting diseases and fever that will destroy your sight and drain away your life. You will plant seed in vain because your enemies will eat it. I will set my face against you so that you will be defeated by your enemies. Those who hate you will rule over you, and you will flee even when no one is pursuing you. If after all this you will not listen to me, I will punish you for your sins 7 times over. I will break down your stubborn pride and make the sky above you like iron and the ground beneath you like bronze. Your strength will be spent in vain because your soil will not yield its crops, nor will the trees of the land yield their fruit. Verse 21, if you remain hostile towards me and refuse to listen to me, I will multiply your affliction 7 times over, as your sins deserve. I will send wild animals against you and will rob you of your children, destroy your cattle, and make you so few in number that your roads will be deserted. Verse 23, if in spite of these things you do not accept my correction, but continue to be hostile toward me, I myself will be hostile towards you and will afflict you for your sins 7 times over. I will bring the sword upon you to avenge the breaking of the covenant. And when you withdraw into your cities, I will send a plague among you, and you will be given into enemy hands. When I cut off your supply of bread, 10 women will be able to bake bread in one oven, and they will dole out the bread by weight. And you will eat, but you will not be satisfied. Verse 27, if in spite of this you still do not listen to me, but continue to be hostile toward me, then in my anger I will be hostile toward you, And I myself will punish you for your sins 7 times over. You will eat the flesh of your sons and the flesh of your daughters. I will destroy your high places and cut down your incense altars and pile your dead bodies on the lifeless forms of your idols, and I will abhor you. I will turn your cities into ruins and lay waste your sanctuaries, and I will take no delight in the pleasing aroma of your offerings. I will lay waste the land so that your enemies who live there will be appalled. Then verse 33, I will scatter you among the nations and will draw out my sword and pursue you. Your land will be laid waste and your cities will lie in ruins. Then the land will enjoy its Sabbath years all the time that it lies desolate, and you are in the country of your enemies. Then the land will rest and enjoy its Sabbaths. All the time that it lies desolate, the land will have the rest it did not have during the Sabbaths that you lived in it. Verse 36, as for those of you who are left, I will make their hearts so fearful in the lands of their enemies that the sound of a wind-blown leaf will put them to flight. They will run as though fleeing from the sword, and they will fall even though no one is pursuing them. They will stumble over one another as though fleeing from the sword, even though no one is pursuing them. So you will not be able to stand before your enemies. You will perish among the nations. The land of your enemies will devour you. Those of you who are left will waste away in the lands of their enemies because of their sins. Also because of their fathers' sins, they will waste away. And then verse 40, but if they will confess their sins and the sins of their fathers, their treachery against me and their hostility toward me, which made me hostile toward them, so that I sent them into the land of their enemies, then when their uncircumcised hearts are humbled and they pay for their sin, I will remember my covenant with Jacob and my covenant with Isaac and my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. For the land will be deserted by them and will enjoy its Sabbaths while it lies desolate without them. And they will pay for their sins because they rejected my laws and abhorred my decrees. Yet in spite of this, when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not reject them or abhor them so as to destroy them completely, breaking my covenant with them. I am Yahweh their God. But for their sake I will remember the covenant with their ancestors whom I brought out of Egypt in the sight of the nations to be their God. I am Yahweh. These are the decrees and laws and the regulations that Yahweh established on Mount Sinai between himself and the Israelites through Moses. But you can't read that and not get emotional. That's, boy. There were six times that he says, in spite of these things, if you do not accept correction. 6 times he says, this is what I'm going to do. Mark.
So this is the, we've talked about this before. I'll bring it up again. So in verse 18 it says, so if also after these things you do not obey me, then I will punish you 7 times more. Well, how long did he tell Elijah to lay on his side for the northern kingdom?
I don't remember exactly.
390.
Okay.
Each one corresponding to years. So multiply 390 times 7. And you get 2,700 and some odd years. If you subtract the year that the northern kingdom went into captivity in 722 BC, it brings you to the year 2008.
Okay.
The end of this very punishment.
That makes sense. Anybody else have any comments about that? John.
The confession of the iniquities of your fathers.
Yep.
That is really powerful to me.
Yeah.
And it also speaks of, Yeshua when he says, I've come but for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, what Mark was bringing up.
Yeah.
Right? When you've paid, when the punishment or the time has been paid, and that's done for, and the capacity for you to come back, that's the good news. That's the gospel. And who does that go to? To the ones who used to be in covenant.
Yeah.
Right? And he talks about, doesn't he talk about a new covenant, a renewed covenant, or
What's
a
that?
circumcision of the heart?
Exactly. It's a covenant with the
That's only a New Testament thing, isn't it?
Uh-huh, right. Yep, yep.
Well, and I just,
Sure, go ahead.
there's a logic to this as well. If you're not going to confess your sins, you're not going to, in other words, you're not going to think through the problem and say, yeah, you know what, I did this. This is wrong. And not only was I wrong, my parents and my parents and my parents' parents and yada, yada, they were wrong in not teaching me those things. And if I don't confess those things, and Yahweh allows me to go back into covenant with him, well, I'm just going to fall back into the bad habits that I did or that my fathers before me, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like that's the whole point of you send your kid into the corner until he figures out what he did wrong. If he never figures that out, then there's no use restoring him or redeeming him back. Does
Yep.
that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
So by following this procedure that God has given us in order to be restored and brought back, like Gary mentioned, we do it each week. We confess the sins, iniquities, and transgressions, and we acknowledge the sins of our forefathers. So if the math is right, and it comes down to 2008, the year prior, 2007, is when they opened that letter from that rabbi who said the Mashiach appeared to him and told him that he was the Mashiach and told him what his name was. And he wrote that name down and sealed it in the envelope. And they opened it up because he died in 2006, Kaduri, and they opened it in 2007, a year before this whole thing, this time ended for the Northern Kingdom.
That's interesting.
So the revelation of the Mashiach comes to light amongst the Jewish people at the time of the Northern Kingdom's, punishment.
Yeah, yeah. Another thing that's interesting about this to me is that I don't know how this works, but it shows that God's view of this thing has encompassed all these generations, of which we're way over here on the end. It's when we confess the sins of our forefathers, there's a long line of forefathers, right? Now, it's funny, it just dawned on me as we were sitting here talking about that. When we confess the sins of our forefathers, we're not, let's see, let me ask the question and see, aren't we also required to forgive our forefathers? Right? We're asking God to. Yes, we've been taught lies. Yes, we've been led on this false path for many, many years. But we have to forgive our forefathers for that because in most cases, they didn't even know they were doing it. That's not in all cases, but certainly in most cases. I don't know. What do you think about that, John? I bet you say, I don't know about that, but...
I want to do a segue.
Okay.
Exodus chapter 20, the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them, for I, Yahweh, thy Elohim, am a jealous El, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and the fourth generation of them that hate me. So what he's saying here in Leviticus seems to me, he's giving you the authority to undo what Yahweh said he was going to do to them in Exodus chapter 5 and allow you to re-enter into covenant with them. Is that pattern? Do you see a similar pattern there?
Yeah. Well, I'm bothered a little by the fourth to the fifth generation or whatever.
Third and the fourth.
Third and the fourth generation.
Well, we were just discussing this last night. The third and the fourth are suffering from the consequences of the iniquities.
Yeah.
It's the iniquities that the guilt, the actual legal, you are guilty of this was the forefathers. You're not guilty of those things, but you will suffer the consequences of those things. Does that make sense? There's
Yes,
a difference
it does.
between,
that makes sense.
in a legal point of view, whether you're legally responsible for something versus you suffering from
Yep.
consequences.
Any other thoughts about that? Okay, then we can move on to the last chapter if you'd like, chapter 27. It's very different, this chapter. I'm not sure what to think about it. By the way, I have one thing I'd like to do before we end, and that is these same people, Bible Project, did a kind of a summary, a verbal, if you will, animated kind of summary of the book of Leviticus, and I'd like to play it because I think it's got some good stuff in it. So why don't we zip through chapter 27? I don't know if that's possible, and then I'll play that at the end. So would someone like to read chapter 27? Let's see. It's a little long to take in one whack. It's let's go to the first 15 verses. Does someone want to read the first 15 verses of chapter? Yeah, go ahead.
And Yahweh spoke to Moshe, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, say to them, when a man separates a vow by your evaluation of lives unto Yahweh, when your evaluation is of a male from 20 years old up to 60 years old, then your evaluation shall be 50 shekels of silver, according to the shekel of the set-apart place. And if it is a female, then your evaluation shall be 30 shekels. And if from 5 years old up to 20 years old, then your evaluation for a male shall be 20 shekels, and for a female, 10 shekels. And if from a new moon old up to 5 years old, then your evaluation for a male shall be 5 shekels of silver. For a female, your evaluation shall be 3 shekels of silver. And if from 60 years old and above, if it is a male, then your evaluation shall be 15 shekels, and for a female, 10 shekels. But if he is too poor to pay your evaluation, then he shall present himself before the priest, and the priest shall set a value for him, according to the ability of him who vowed, the priest shall value him. And if it is a beast of which they bring an offering to Yahweh, all such given to Yahweh is set apart. He is not to replace it or exchange it, good for spoiled or spoiled for good. And if he at all exchange beast for beast, then both it and the one exchanged for it is set apart. And if it is any unclean beast of which they do not bring an offering to Yahweh, then he shall present the beast before the priest. And the priest shall value it, whether it is good or spoiled, according to your evaluation, O priests, so it shall be. But if he indeed redeems it, then he shall add 1/5 to your evaluation. And when a man sets his house apart to be set apart to Yahweh, then the priest shall value it, whether it is good or spoiled, as the priest values it, so it stands. And if he who sets it apart does redeem his house, then he shall add 1/5 of the silver of your evaluation to it, and it shall be his.
Okay, let's talk about that for a minute because it seems a little vague when you first read it. What is all this stuff about? I have a note in my Bible here that helps me with it. What it says in chapter 27, first says, Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the Israelites and say to them, if anyone makes a special vow to dedicate persons to Yahweh by giving equivalent value, then set the value, blah, blah, blah. So why would someone make a special value or special vow to dedicate persons to Yahweh?
So this is like a parent dedicating a child or something?
Well, I'll tell you the best example that I know of is Hannah dedicating Samuel.
Right.
Yeah, it says, my little note says, this may have referred to the practice of giving oneself, a slave, or a child to tabernacle or temple service. Generally, such vows were made when requesting something of God. For example, the story of Samuel. When the request was granted, the person would then fulfill the vow. That such vows could be converted into payments of money served a practical purpose, providing the sanctuary with necessary operating funds. In other words, if you came to the tabernacle, to the priest, and said, well, in the case of Samuel, Hannah, she says, if God will hear my prayer and grant me a child, I will dedicate him to temple service. Now, she could do that. And then if she has the child, then she had the ability to redeem him. Okay? She could have, according to this little chart here, it says if the person is between the ages of 5 and 20, which maybe that was when Samuel was when she went back, then she would have given 20 shekels and she could have gotten Samuel back. Now, in her case, she didn't intend to do that. She says, I'm going to dedicate him and I'm going to leave him here for life. But this was, I gather, a common practice for, another one that we just read about, a house. If a man decides he will dedicate his house. I don't know what for, but he could dedicate his house. Now, in general, the priesthood might not have any need for the house, right? So they would set the value of the house at something, and then the man could get the house back by paying that. I guess that's where he had to add 20% or something. Anyway, this is the rules for valuing things that people want to redeem. People want to give the value. And what it says is that a lot of times what people would give, the priesthood doesn't really need. And so they're allowed to get rid of it, either sell it or let someone else redeem it, let the person who gave it redeem it. I think that's what this is all about.
I did a word study on this.
Yep.
The word here is Eric. My brother's name is
Eric,
Eric.
yep.
Or Eric, yeah. And it means array, order, or estimation. We talked about order at Shabbat, Mark did. I don't think he talked about this word, but it's used a lot in this chapter.
Yep.
24 times I counted.
I think the reason for that is because, again, it's trying to lay down some guidelines so that there's less room for greed and graft and things. That this is what this stuff is worth. Just in case you wanted to know, a 5-year-old boy is worth 20 shekels.
So why is this here? I mean, it's very, Hannah, was that who won? Yeah. She did a very, wonderful thing and spiritual thing, I guess you could say. And she probably reasoned, well, I don't have a child anyway, so if I get one, I'm going to dedicate it to convince God to let me have a child. Mm-hmm. There's some rationale behind that. But what? I'm just curious. Why is this here? What is this solving? Is this a big picture? Is this a big picture thing that God is solving?
I don't know.
Well, I have an idea.
Okay.
I just kind of thought it up.
You're just good. As you were speaking, the answer came to you. Huh?
Bing. So, in the olden age, of course, we can't really say that now. We're suffering the same problem. Children didn't have a lot of times. They just didn't have any value. If there's anything wrong with them, or if they're whatever, they had the authority to just,
yeah,
kill them, get rid of them, whatever. Of course, we do that now with abortions.
Yeah.
So, if you're going to do that, why don't you just adopt them? Why don't you give them set it at the door of the priest house or something like that?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. That's what I'm. What is God trying to solve by? That's just kind of.
Well, I don't know. This may be a penny will drop when we finish it because it goes in a strange way at the end.
Okay.
Okay. Someone want to read from 16 to the end of the chapter, into the whole book? I'll read it. Okay. Starting in verse 16. If a man dedicates to Yahweh part of his family land, its value is to be set according to the amount of seed required for it, 50 shekels of silver to an omer of barley seed. If he dedicates his field during the year of Jubilee, the value that has been set remains. But if he dedicates the field after the Jubilee, the priest will determine the value according to the number of years that remain until the next year of Jubilee, and its set value will be reduced. If the man who dedicates the field wishes to redeem it, he must add a fifth to its value, and the field will become his. If, however, he does not redeem the field, or if he has sold it to someone else, it can never be redeemed. When the field is released to Jubilee, it will become holy, set apart, like a field devoted to Yahweh. It will become the property of the priests. If a man dedicates to Yahweh a field he has bought, which is not part of his family land, The priest will determine its value up to the year of Jubilee, and the man must pay its value on that day as something holy to Yahweh. In the year of Jubilee, the field will revert to the person from whom he bought it and the one whose land it was. Every value is to be set according to the sanctuary shekel, 20 gerahs to the shekel. No one, however, may dedicate the firstborn of an animal, since the firstborn already belongs to Yahweh. Whether ox or sheep, it is Yahweh's. If it is one of the unclean animals, he may buy it back at its set value, adding a fifth to the value of it. If he does not redeem it, it is to be sold at its set value. But nothing that a man owns or devotes to the Lord, whether a man or animal or family land, may be sold or redeemed. Everything so devoted is most holy to the Lord. I should point out that word devote is different than dedicate. Okay? So we've changed subjects here. It says, nothing that a man owns and devotes to Yahweh, whether man or animal or family land, may be sold or redeemed. Everything so devoted must be to the Lord. No person devoted to destruction may be ransomed. He must be put to death. A tithe of everything from the land, whether grain or soil or fruit from the trees, belongs to Yahweh. It is holy to Yahweh. If a man redeems any of his tithe, he must add a fifth of it, of the value to it. The entire tithe of the herd and flock, every 10th animal that passes under the shepherd's rod, will be holy to Yahweh. He must not pick out the good from the bad or make any substitution. If he does make a substitution, both the animal and its substitute become holy and cannot be redeemed. These are the commands that Yahweh gave Moses on Mount Sinai. So the reason I said it goes in a strange term, that thing about devoted to Yahweh is really unusual. It's a different word. The word for that is karim, and it usually implies destruction. It's dedicated to destruction, dedicated for destruction. And that's what happens when someone is found guilty of a capital crime. I don't get a lot of this. I mean, really, I guess this doesn't clear anything up particularly. It's, to me, the whole purpose of this is to give written guidelines to the priests so that they can put a consistent value on the things that people might dedicate to God. But that's the best I can do. What do you think?
How long is this video?
Oh, a
We're
few
getting
minutes.
ready.
If you want to say something, go right ahead.
Well, I'm just curious. What do the priests do with it?
Well, if
They reinvest into do they spend it all because
yes.
they?
Well, if they
have the
had a
capacity
need,
to
if
spend
they had
it.
a need for the items,
Right.
whatever they might be, then they would keep them. If they didn't, they would sell them at this price, and they would take the money and do whatever they needed. You know, they'd give the tabernacle a new coat of paint or whatever. They would do the things they need to do the job of the priesthood.
Well, maybe my mind is trying to make something out of this that's not here, but could they invest in the community and say, you know,
They
we need
might.
a major work here, land work or something that, you know, an individual farmer can't really do by himself. I don't know. I'm just throwing out.
It could be. It could be. It's
Because if you're really doing well and if you're doing the Torah, all these good things are going to happen. Your problem is going to be, what am I going to do with all my stuff?
yeah. It could be.
You know, let's give it to the priest and let them, at their level of what needs to get done, get done.
Yeah, that could be. I think this bears looking into some more. I suppose I could have come a little better prepared, but it's confusing to me. However, did you have something, Margaret?
It seems like this is a way to approach Yahweh. If there is a need for something that you want to approach Him, and you always have to approach Yahweh with something.
Yeah, don't come to me empty-handed.
Don't
he
come
says.
empty-handed. And so I think
thought.
not only that, but I think in the everyday market type transactions that they needed to have, this is a good estimation of what, the estimation or the valuations is guidelines for the market practice.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of what this was
Yeah.
intended for, was that.
So those are my thoughts.
Okay, why don't you let me put this summary up that I wanted to do, and then we'll call it a night. Let me turn off the light so you can see it better. So I'm the only guy that knows how to find it there. I'll go do that.
The book of Leviticus. It's the third book of the Bible, and it's set right after the exodus of the Israelites from their slavery, when God brought them to the foot of Mount Sinai and invited Israel into a covenant relationship. Now, they had quickly rebelled and broke that covenant, and God had wanted for his glorious presence to come and live right in the midst of Israel in the form of this tabernacle. But Israel's sin has damaged the relationship. So, at the end of the previous book, Exodus, Moses, as Israel's representative, could not even enter God's presence in the tent. The book of Leviticus opens by reminding us of this fundamental problem. It says, "The Lord called to Moses from the tent." So the question is, how can Israel, in their sin and selfishness, be reconciled to this holy God? That's what this book is all about, how God is graciously providing a way for sinful, corrupt people to live in his holy presence. Now, let's pause for a second and explore this really important idea that God is holy. It's fundamental to understanding this book. The word holy means simply to be set apart or unique. And in the Bible, God is set apart from all other things because of his
The book of Leviticus, we know you've been avoiding it because it's weird. So let's fix that. Now remember, the story of the Bible began with humans in God's presence, but they were banished because of their rebellion. However, God wants to be in relationship with us, so he chooses one family that he will use to restore the world back into his presence.
And so God's presence comes to dwell in a tent right in the middle of Israel.
And that's great.
But it creates a problem because it's so intense that Moses can't go in, and other priests who enter inappropriately, they die.
Well, wait, if God's presence is good, how is it all of a sudden dangerous for people?
So think of it this way. God's presence is like the sun. It's pure power and goodness. And when something mortal and corruptible gets close to such pure power, it's destroyed. And so the word holiness is used in Leviticus to describe God's pure and powerful presence, which, like the sun, is both good and dangerous. So the point of Leviticus is to show how corrupt Israelites can live near God's goodness without being destroyed. Now, in the book, there are 3 ways for how this is all going to work out, and these are going to seem strange to you, but just hang in there with us.
The first one is rituals. The second is this idea of the priesthood, and the third is a bunch of purity laws.
Now, the book is broken up into 7 sections, and each solution is explored in 2 sections of the book. The rituals are here, the priests are here, and the purity laws go here.
Now, the first solution, rituals, involves a lot of animal sacrifices. And so Leviticus begins with detailed instructions for how to make these sacrifices. Some are ways of saying thank you to God, and others are simply ways of saying, I'm sorry.
And here at the end of the book, there are some more rituals. These are about observing sacred days and festivals. They're all celebrations that retell some part of the story of how God rescued Israel and set them apart from the nations.
The second solution to the holiness problem has to do with priests. You see, being directly in God's presence is really dangerous. So he appoints priests as special representatives who can go into his presence on behalf of others.
So in this section, we have a story about how the priests are ordained into the priesthood. And then this other section explains the set of higher standards that the priests have to live by because they work so closely to God's presence.
The third solution in the book is all about purity laws. And this is by far the hardest thing to understand. For example, in this section, we're really concerned with knowing whether you're clean or unclean.
Or another way of saying that is being pure and impure. And here's what we need to know to understand this. When you're in a pure state, you can be near God's presence. When you're in an impure state, you can't. And so it was really important for Israelites to know what state they're in at any given moment.
So the first thing we have is a list of pure and impure animals.
Yeah, this list of animals is divided up by where they live. So on the land, in the sea, in the air. And the text is just not clear about why certain animals are impure or why touching or eating them makes you impure. What is clear, however, is that avoiding these creatures will set Israel apart, and it will remind them that God's own holiness should affect every part of their lives, including what they eat.
After the food laws, we get a lot of random rules about things like skin disease, touching dead bodies, what to do with bodily fluids.
But they're not random. All of these are things that the Israelites associated with life and death, which are sacred things because God is the author of life.
Okay, but simply coming into contact with these things makes you impure?
They do, but we have to keep in mind that it's not wrong or sinful to be ritually impure. You just wait a few days, take a bath, offer sacrifice, and you're pure again. What is inappropriate is entering into God's presence when you're in an impure state.
Now, there's more purity laws over here in this section.
Yeah, these focus on Israel's moral behavior. So these are laws about social justice, healthy relationships, having sexual integrity. Living by these laws will make Israel into a morally pure people who can live near God's presence.
Those are the three solutions. Now, you've probably noticed that they surround the very center of this book, and it's here that we find a really important ritual called the Day of Atonement.
Yeah, so Israel's a big tribe now, and odds are there's a lot of sin happening that goes unnoticed, that people are not dealing with. And so one time a year, the priests would take 2 goats, and one of those goats is killed, and its blood is carried right into God's presence where it symbolically covers or atones for Israel's sin.
Yeah, that's kind of weird.
Well, the meaning of the sacrifice, it's explained in the next chapter, where God says that the blood of a creature is its life. And so this goat's life is offered as a substitute. It's receiving God's punishment for Israel's sin so that the people don't have to.
That leaves the second goat.
Yeah, the priest puts his hands on it, and then he confesses all the sins of Israel. It's like he's placing the sins on the goat. And then that goat gets cast out forever into the wilderness. It's called the scapegoat.
Yeah, I've heard that word before.
Yeah, it's this very powerful image of how God is graciously removing Israel's sin.
But let's be honest, sacrifices in general seem so barbaric.
We have to remember that in the ancient world, sacrifices were the main way of buying favor from the gods. But the problem was that those same gods, they're unpredictable, they're fickle, you never know if they're going to ignore you or they're going to turn on you. And so it's in this cultural setting that we see Israel's God as totally different. He does get angry about human corruption, but it is never arbitrary. And he loves people. So he provides this clear way for Israel to know with confidence that they are forgiven and that despite their corruption, they are safe to live near his presence. And so that makes the book of Leviticus actually a revolutionary statement in its day.
So that's Leviticus. But Israel's still at Mount Sinai in the middle of the wilderness. They need a place to live.
Yes, the land God promised to Abraham. And so the journey to that land is what the next book of the Bible is all about. Hi, this is Tim.
And this is John.
We believe the Bible is telling
kind of a good summary, but it goes awfully fast. Since it goes awfully fast, it's thebibleproject.com. Go look at them. Everything on there is worth looking at. Are there any final comments? Next week we'll start Numbers. If anybody wants a Numbers book, I've got one. Any thoughts? Okay, let me close in prayer. Father God, thank you for the evening. Thank you for your book of Leviticus. Personally, I enjoyed the challenges. I enjoyed the new things that I learned. And I hope that you'll just keep this in all of our minds. Help us to think on these things as we go through our day, through our week. And just thank you so much for putting this in front of us, for teaching us what we need to know. And just help us to be courageous and a good example of what you'd like to have your people live like in this world. Keep us safe till we meet together next week. In Yeshua's name, amen. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Jerry.